this evening to the IPEN sponsored side event at the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention Conference of the Parties. This particular side event will be, the subject will be plastics and chemicals under the Stockholm Convention and the impact on the ground and potential synergies and gaps in relation to a future plastics treaty. We have a number of distinguished speakers here this evening. I'll just briefly introduce them and then give a more thorough description as more people will probably join us in the room just before they give their presentations. To begin the speaker process, we have Titakorn Bunpung Mai, or P, from Earth Thailand, and he is Earth's Toxic Waste and Industrial Pollution Program Manager, and he'll be speaking on environmental, food and human body burden of dichlorane plus in a waste recycling area in Thailand. No room for exemptions. We also have Therese Carlson from IPEN, who is IPEN's Senior Science and Technical Advisor with a PhD in plastic pollution, and she'll be talking on lessons learned from 25 years of working with the Stockholm Convention and plastics. And to my left, we have both Nico Erho and Karen Rabenheimer. Nico is an author, scholar and consultant, and will be speaking on, and jointly they'll be speaking on global governance of plastics and associated chemicals, a report prepared for the BRS Secretariat. And Karen is a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, Australia, with a PhD in international policy to prevent marine plastic pollution. So I believe we are ready to get underway. So perhaps if we can, I beg your pardon, my screen hasn't scrolled up sufficiently. And last but certainly not least, we have Thomas Shah from the Government of Norway, a senior advisor for the Department of Marine Management and Pollution Control at the Ministry of Climate and Environment Norway, who will be talking on regulating chemicals in plastics under the Stockholm Convention and the new plastics treaty. Thank you. And if you would like to begin with your presentation.
Yes.
And just a quick word for people in the audience to remember that the microphones are on the roof. So if we could just keep any conversations low. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Good evening, everyone in the on-site and in the online. My name is Titakorn Bunpung Mai. My position is Toxic Waste and Industrial Pollution Program Manager from Earth Thailand. Today, I will release a study of dichlorane plus from an e-waste recycling site in Thailand. It is a joint study between Earth, Anika, and IPEN. Dichlorane plus is a polychlorinated flame retardant used in electrical and motor vehicle. It's regardable substitute for the decarbide. Dichlorane plus is dangerous chemicals that all accumulate and have long-range transportation potential. And Public Review Committee recommended to listing in Annex A of the Stockholm Convention in this year, but exemption for use and production potentially lasting till 2044. In our study, we collecting the sample in 4 parts of e-waste processing, from dismantling to ash from open burning in the dump site. And this picture, you can see the black one on the ground. This is the ash from the open burning dump site first, and the villager, the worker, brought back to the workshop and process it again. Just find some thing in the ash or some metal, Yes. This picture is of e-waste recycling site in area in our study. And many recycling area are close to the living area and the outdoor kitchen. And from this picture, you can see the working area and some rest area as the white building near that. It's the same place and it's very close. Yes, and this picture in the picture you can see a lot of e-waste, a lot of motor vehicle, and this the motorcycle is preparing to the some e-waste processing. And this front picture have a lot of e-waste and some motor vehicle, and this maybe man or woman, just workers. They don't wear anything to protect just the personal safety or something like that. They don't wear anything. Yes, yes, it's a free range chicken. Oh, sorry, it's the free range. Oh, it's delayed. Okay, just delayed. Okay, it's the free range chicken. We found that in the study areas. Yes. And this truck prepare to transport the e-waste from worker area and to the and bring it to the dump site and some open burning. This just our just the dump site of our study. You can see some small parts in this dump site. This is the researcher in the. I'm not sure you see this because this is so small because the dump site is really big. And it's in the dump site have a lot of e-waste, a lot of another waste. They dump it in the same place and always have burn it and open burn it and have a lot of the air pollution from this. And this show how they burn a wire, a plastic or foam casing or some other from the electrical and motor vehicle. And for our study, we have 11 type of sample to collect it, dust, soil, sediment, ash, waste is a shredded plastic piece, rice, fish, snail, crab, eggs, and actually blood serum from the human blood. The control side, we are just collecting the sample at the organic farm. And for the environmental sample and the food stuff, we collect from the organic farm with no e-waste activity. And for the blood sample, we collect from the farmer working in or living in the same village as the farm with has done e-waste recycling. And for the control eggs, we bought from the supermarket in other area. And this picture, we have some the picture show that how we collecting the dust from the floor. And next show the results of this study. From the result, we found the contaminant of the pollen parts in many samples, like the dust, soil, sediment, ash, in the fish, in the snail, in the egg, and in the human blood. And the volume of this contaminant is human blood is very high. And From the result, we can say that e-waste dismantling or recycling are a sort of decaying parts in household dust, and found that decaying parts was detected in the dust of a workshop that stopped e-waste operation over 10 years ago. And from the graph show that the difference in concentration of decaying parts in dust of working area and living area of e-waste workers. And the working area is higher higher level of decaying parts than the living areas. And yes, from the result, say that transport, the storage and the shedding of various types of plastic residue is a source of decaying parts contamination of outdoor environment. And the dump site and the traffic of waste associated with it is a source of contamination of decaying parts in the surrounding environment. And from the graph, this is inverse variation between the decaying parts in the sediment and dust, and this distance from the dump site. When you see the distance from the dump site increase, the concentration of decaying parts in the sediment and dust is decreased. And at the 0 meter from the dump site have the highest level of decaying parts. And higher concentration of decaying parts in sediment and dust are found in the east and south direction of the dump site. Because to the east there are some leakage points, and to the south there is a road to the dump site which is used to transport e-waste. And from the result is about the foodstuff. Say that the dump site might be a source of contamination of foodstuff in surrounding areas. We collecting the sample of the foodstuff like a snail and fish around the dump site, in the pond around the dump site, and they found it, and they found some contaminate of the decaying parts. And e-waste and end-of-life vehicle recycling are a source of decaying parts contamination of chicken eggs. And the main point about the blood work on the blood from the workers, we have two groups from of the sample. The first is control group. We have 26 control group. We have 26 volunteer for the control group, and we found 1 out of 26 has decaying parts in blood. But for the e-waste worker group, they found 34 out of 40, or can say that 85% of have decaying parts in blood serum exceeding. This show that the result of our study is still link the decaying parts level in Thai e-waste worker with recycling activity in their communities. And this is overall of our study, the some result and show that the source and level of the decaying parts appropriate with to the worker in recycling site in Thailand. But the volume of this is a average volume of the decaying parts of all this. And for the conclusion of our study, if continue use of decaying parts will continue the exposure of e-waste worker in Thailand and other places to this dangerous chemical. It is time to release decaying parts in Annex A with no exemption and labeling of products that contain nicotine plastic, so that party can identify this substance in products and waste and fulfill requirement under Article 6. Thank you for your attention.
I'd just like to thank P again for his great presentation, and just to remind people that he is from the NGO Earth in Thailand, which is an independent non-government organisation striving for social and environmental sustainability and justice in Thai society. And Earth focuses on the impacts of hazardous substances on ecosystems, local communities, and workers' health. So thanks very much for that. And now that the room is got a few more audience members, I'd just like to reintroduce Therese Carlson, IPEN's Science and Technical Advisor, to speak on lessons learned from 25 years of working with the Stockholm Convention and plastics.
Very much, Lee, and thank you so much for your presentation. I think it's so important when we're sitting in these negotiation rooms, in these contact groups, to remember what are the on-the-ground consequences. To clarify this title, I don't personally have the privilege of having worked 25 years with the Stockholm Convention, because I was quite young when it was started, but IPEN has. IPEN was actually started and founded around the Stockholm Convention during the INC process that led to the Stockholm Convention as we know today. And since a lot of POPs are used in plastics, this also means that we've been working with chemicals in plastics for 25 years. And I want to share a few of the lessons that we in the network have learned over these years. This is one of the earlier reports from 2005, which showed that waste incineration was transporting toxic chemicals into the food chain. Here we can already see that plastics are transporting toxic chemicals into the food chain. The transport of toxic chemicals from plastics will be a little bit of a theme in here. But since then, we've worked throughout the life cycle of plastics, and we can see that there's similar problems throughout. So in this study, we looked at plastic pellets from 23 different countries, and all the sample locations contain PCBs and UV328, which is another one of the chemicals that are discussed this week, showing that plastics are transporting toxic chemicals globally, even before the plastics are becoming plastic products. In another study, we looked at different products that come in contact with children's mouths, so baby bottles and such. And we found that 78% of all those samples contained bisphenol A, which is an endocrine disruptor, even though 23 of them were labeled BPA free. 14 of those that were labeled as BPA free contained BPA, which I think really shows why the transparency is so important. Especially since we know that BPA can leach from baby bottles or into baby food, and that this has potential health consequences. This shows that plastics are transporting toxic chemicals into our homes, into our bodies, with very limited controls and no transparency. In another study, we looked at several other studies, we looked at recycled plastics. Here are two examples. In one of them, we saw that out of proposed ampoules, 22 had brominated flame retardants. In another one where we looked at toys, again, not an area where you want to have toxic chemicals, we found that they all contained brominated flame retardant. 72 out of 73 samples contained decabd, which is listed under the Stockholm Convention. In the recycled pellets, we also found BPA, we found benzotriazole UV stabilizers, including UV328. This shows that when plastics that contain toxic chemicals are recycled, they are transporting those chemicals into new products. This also has effect for workers' health. There are studies, this is not an IPEN study, but there are scientific published studies that shows clear exposure risk associations between workers' health and handling plastic pellets, recycled plastic pellets. So we found that plastics are transporting toxic chemicals into the environment, in our food, and into us. And maybe not, in case not everyone has been able to keep up with all the infdocs that show up at the BRS webpage. Just today, there was a new document on chemicals in plastics that showed up as an infdoc, or as the summary, the policy summary of that. The first key finding reads, chemicals are integral parts of plastics, with over 13,000 substances so far associated with plastics. So, plastics are chemicals. They are chemical monomers, chemical polymers, and they are chemical additives. And as our speakers will talk a little bit more later, this report was also released earlier this week. And it shows very clearly that only a very small fraction of those chemicals are regulated internationally. But I'm sure we'll get more into that later. So let's focus back on the Stockholm Convention. The chemicals that are currently under evaluation of the Stockholm Convention, I listed 6 here, but actually one of them got listed with no exemptions this Monday, methoxychlor, which replaced DDT, which I still think is something that is important to think about in this discussion. Then there's UV328, used in plastic. There's D-chlorine plus, used in plastic and replaced decabd. There's medium chain chlorinated paraffins, used in plastic and replaced short chain chlorinated paraffins. There's chlorpyrifos, which has some uses in plastics. And there's long chain PFCAs, which is also used in plastics. As you can see, there's a lot of POPs that are used in plastics. As you can see, there are also a lot of POPs that have retractable substitution. And I think this is one of the lessons learned that we have from the Stockholm Convention is that we need to talk about chemicals as groups when we're talking about how to regulate them. And there are already so much data out there on big groups of chemicals. I know that your report lists some of the groups that could be addressed. I know that the new paper lists, the new report lists several groups of chemicals that could be addressed. Here's a very non-exhaustive list of some of the chemicals that could be addressed, because there is a lot of science on these groups showing that they cause harm to human health and the environment. And when we start talking about how to address chemicals under the Plastics Treaty, I think that there's a lot of important things that we can draw on from the Stockholm Convention. There's so many key elements in the Stockholm Convention that would be useful under Plastics Treaty. It's a globally legally binding mechanism. It focuses on elimination rather than managing risk, which will be very important. It has provisions for adding new chemicals. It identifies an inventory and contaminated sites for cleanups. It has an effectiveness evaluation, and it is based on the precautionary principle and states that full scientific knowledge should not prevent a chemical from moving forward in the evaluation. There's also a lot of useful language under the Stockholm Convention. It talks about the importance of impacts upon women and children, and through them upon future generations. It talks about the need for global action. And it acknowledges that the precaution underlies the concerns of all the parties and is embedded in the convention. So at IPEN, we believe that it is crucial that the protection of human health and the environment is reflected throughout the control measures for the Plastics Treaty in order to address chemicals in plastics, because plastics are chemicals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Teres, for that. And in my haste to introduce all of these interesting speakers, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Lee Bell, and I'm IPEN's Mercury and POPs Policy Officer. And IPEN is the International Pollutants Elimination Network. And we're working towards a toxic-free future for all. And just a little note that when the Stockholm Convention was being negotiated and eventually adopted, I was actually living on a contaminated site in Australia and organising an alliance of groups to help clean up other contaminated sites as well. So it's interesting to come full circle and actually get involved in global governance of issues like dioxin and contaminated sites and so forth. So it's been quite a long road for both the convention and myself. But moving along now, I'd like to again just to introduce Nico Erho and Karen Rabenheimer, and just to explain a little bit about their work. Nico is an author, scholar and consultant who's authored several international reports, articles and books on global sustainability governance, as well as thematic topics related to biodiversity, chemicals and plastics, including participating as one of the lead authors in the preparation of the Global Chemicals Outlook 2, while Karen is a senior lecturer at the University of Wollongong, Australia, with a PhD in international policy to prevent marine plastic pollution. And Karen has led several studies on global and regional plastics governance, including the UNEP report assessing the effectiveness of relevant government strategies presented at UNEA 3. And together with Nico, the Nordic report titled Possible Elements of a New Global Agreement to Prevent Plastic Pollution, and the report we will hear about today for the Basel Convention, mapping the global governance of plastics and associated chemicals. And again, the title of the presentation is Opportunities for Restricting Chemicals and Polymers of Concerns in Plastics. And I'll hand over to you now.
So I'll present first and then I'll hand over to Nico. So thank you and thanks for the shout out on the report. We've got a number of topics that we would like to just chat about this evening, and some have been mentioned. But firstly, we're talking a lot about hazard criteria and prioritization and listing. So we thought we'd put forward what we feel is the underlying mechanism that could potentially be used for this agreement and how that would fit into that. There's also the number of chemicals and polymers, which we've touched on, identifying and listing those chemicals of concern, existing criteria for prioritization, which we've outlined in the report, and then also the grouping of chemicals approach versus, and as well as the hazard or risk-based approach. Transparency is obviously important, so we'll touch on that, the scientific mechanism, and then sustainability criteria, which would link back up to the first slide, which is on the underlying mechanisms. So this is something we put forward in.
Excuse me, do you have a possibility to speak up? It's so difficult to hear you down here.
I'll try and talk louder. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So in the Nordic report that was mentioned, which we did in 2020, we outlined sort of a criteria, well, a hierarchy for the agreement. And I think this is important to understand where these hazard listings could fit in if should we get them under the new agreement. So if we firstly had our international sustainability criteria, which we've been talking about, and it's included in a number of the submissions to IMC2, part of that could be the hazard criteria that we're talking about here as a section of the sustainability criteria. And that could be included in the text of the agreement, in annexes and in guidelines. What I think is important here is that those are developed to a level that meets the WTO definition of international standards. That would enable it to be used for trade measures at the domestic level. Those trade measures could be outlined to some level in the global agreement, but generally that will be done at the domestic level, where we can then restrict markets based on the sustainability criteria and develop market-based instruments to start help funding, for instance, your EPR schemes, etc. once you've sort of sorted out your trade, that would help you with your environmentally sound management of wastes in your country, help you to apply the waste hierarchy more efficiently. And here the Basel Convention becomes important, particularly the proximity principle. So hopefully you can manage that waste domestically more efficiently, but also trade under the Basel Convention more efficiently as well. So that's the high level. What you've seen this already, we've changed the coloring a little bit to sort of reflect a bit more around the concept of black, grey and white lists. And the potential for them, obviously there's a lot of discussion that needs to happen there, but as we know, there's studies have shown that there's about 13,000 chemicals used in plastics. Of that, the big grey area, there's no hazard data on them at all. Potentially going into a grey list. The black areas, those that are potential chemicals of concern that are unregulated. And then we have the white area, which is chemicals of concern, of low concern, based on available data. And the small little sliver in red is what we have regulated, and that's under the Stockholm, Montreal Protocol and the Minamata Convention. So this just summarizes the numbers from that illustration. Of those 13,000, we have about 46% are have no hazard data at all. 1% are regulated under those 3 conventions I mentioned, or instruments. 24% are unregulated, and there's 29% listed as low concern. But I guess here it's important to know that there's various criteria for hazard measurement, and some of these are only have only been assessed under one criteria. So should they be assessed under other criteria, they may no longer fall under the low concern. Right. So when we move to polymers of concern, these have not been properly assessed. One study, it is grey literature, estimates there could be 200,000 polymers in use, of which 30,000 could be hazardous, but it's just important to note that that's all uses, not just in plastics. So the lack of information on our polymers, on polymer identities, really stops us from having a proper hazard assessment on them. So it's an important component here. So what have we got? I think this isn't news to many of you in the room here, but just looking at what we do have at the moment, the Stockholm Convention, as we know, prohibits and restricts the use of listed POPs. Some of these are used in plastics, amongst others, as additives, such as the flame retardants and plasticizers or surfactants. It restricts the release of unintentional POPs. This is often from the open burning of waste and waste incineration, as we've heard. So the Montreal Protocol prohibits the use of controlled substances, the ODSs and the HFCs, including their use as a blowing agent in the production of extruded polystyrene and polyurethane foams. It does provide some exemptions for use as controlled substances as processing agents and feedstocks in plastics. The Minamata Convention then restricts our use of mercury and mercury compounds in the production of polyurethane using mercury-containing catalysts and in vinyl chloride monomer production. Just moving back to the possible approach of listings under the new agreement, we can learn from some of these agreements, particularly around the Stockholm Convention, which we know uses a negative list or a blacklist. So the hazard and risk criteria are used here by a scientific committee to put some recommendations forward for listing by the COP. But some of the considerations here is that data on exposure is scarce. This could lead to the duplication of work or undermine work of the existing scientific bodies. The Rotterdam Convention also uses a negative blacklist, which could be adapted. And here the presence of chemicals in the lists in regulated from 2 UN regions could trigger a listing under the convention. There's a large portion of chemicals would directly qualify for listing, and we expect the workload on this could be moderate. Considerations here are that countries and regions with limited data on the chemicals could be underrepresented in this model, and there could be the ad hoc nature of listings could be problematic. With the London Protocol, this is an example of a whitelist, and here this could also be adapted. So the use of safe chemicals is allowed if approved by a scientific body and listed in a positive list. It could be narrowed to specific applications, and food contact comes to mind here, in toys. This could lead to regrettable substitution, as it's not commonly based on groups of chemicals. Then there's a high risk of whitelisting of hazardous chemicals as science becomes available. There's also the hybrid approach where we could employ a black and a white list with also a grey list, as we mentioned. But here I think an important consideration is some mechanism to move chemicals across the lists should new science show them to be more hazardous than we thought initially. So with that, I will hand over to Nika. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll provide first an overview of existing criteria for listing chemicals at the moment. So to identify chemicals of concern, there are the 4 conventions that provide for this. It's POPS, Stockholm Convention, the Minamata Convention, and then, of course, the Montreal Protocol that has criteria for listing ozone-depleting substances and fluorocarbons. But when it comes to other chemicals of concern, we only have voluntary criteria listed under CITEM that include both hazard and risk criteria. But this is not any legally binding consequences of listing any chemicals of concern under CITEM. And then we have, of course, recommendations from OECD for identification of polymers of concern. And these are used by countries and jurisdictions in a very selective basis. So countries who aim to restrict certain polymers of concern have used these criteria based on cherry-picking criteria that they use, but there is no overall criteria at the global level for identifying and prioritizing polymers of concern. So it's become common knowledge that we need to move towards a grouping of chemicals approach, as we've heard here already in the previous interventions. And the Stockholm Convention provides a good example of a grouping based on a negative list. And this started already in the first COP, when the PCBs, a big group of chemicals that have been used in plastics, were listed. So this is over 50 chemicals used in plastics that have been listed in the very early phases of the Stockholm Conventions. Of course, the dioxins and furans is a big group of chemicals also listed that are used or is an end result of incineration of plastics. And then we have P4 and other groups that have been listed under the Stockholm Convention. So this provides one good starting point, but of course we need to go even further than the Stockholm Convention. Then scholars have introduced a concept of chemical simplification, which implies the use of a positive list for a limited number of substances known to be safe. And this also aims to facilitate a grouping of chemicals approach. And this is an area that could also be explored in the plastics instrument as we go forward in thinking of how to regulate plastics. And where should we start in regulating chemicals of concern used in plastics? So it could start with groups of chemicals where we have high scientific consensus of harm caused by plastics-related exposure. And this includes bisphenols, flame retardants, and phthalates that have already high scientific consensus. And PFAS, which is much now talked about, it also has a medium scientific consensus of harm caused by plastics-related exposure. So these 4 groups would provide a good starting point based on the existing scientific evidence. And a good example comes from the European Chemicals Agency that has assessed a group of 148 bisphenols and recommended restriction of over 30 bisphenols based on their impacts on the hormonal reproductive consequences. And what about adopting a hazard and risk-based approach? So this is an area where we got a lot of comments into our draft report. with others arguing for a completely hazard-based approach to listing chemicals, focusing on the intrinsic ecotoxicological properties of chemicals, such as EMPs, PBTs, CMR, and EDCs. And this would align with the precautionary approach, and this would also enable to achieve safe circularity of plastics, what many are now voicing for, because if you have certain chemicals that are identified to be hazardous, if you put them in the markets, you cannot achieve a safe circularity of plastics. And then on the other hand, there's a lot of comments and views about having a risk-based approach, which is used under the Stockholm Convention, that then combines hazards of chemicals with likelihood and extent and exposure. And that would take into account other factors than ecotoxicological properties, such as volume, frequency of use, potential routes of exposure, sensitivity of exposed populations, and so on. But the problem here is the scarcity of exposure data, because it allows the continued use of numerous known chemicals of concern until a risk evaluation is completed. And often this takes many years, so there would be a time lag before any of such substances would be listed under a risk-based approach. Transparency for chemical safety is now very topical, and I've heard this issue being raised in many of the side events here during this week. And it is fundamentally about the need to strengthen the right to know. And this principle has been defined in the Aarhus Convention and the ESCASU Agreement. And the Aarhus Convention, for example, requires that you need to put the information of the product content so that consumers can make informed choices. And why do we need to do it? It's to inform consumers and retailers to help drive informed consumer choices. So this can in fact be one of the most important control measures of the plastics instrument. If we have enough transparent information of the product content, then actually the consumers can drive the markets to detoxify the markets. Also, it's important to facilitate the detection of chemicals of concern in customs control, especially because many developing countries are net importers of plastics products with chemicals, so it would help them to detect and reject any chemicals concerned used in plastics. And also it would enable safe circularity of plastics, as mentioned already. And what are the ways to do it? The provision of public available information on the chemical content of plastics is a key component of transparency. Of course, labeling of products is important. The provision of safety data sheets that is already to some extent implemented. And then the use of modern digital tools, such as digital product passports, would be extremely important, as EU already has launched an initiative on this to enable to track the presence or the composition of the products, including data on the value chain and the origin of the products. And then the use of HS codes to track trade is also important. And there are also other means to increase transparency, including collection and dissemination of information through inventories. Sharing of hazard and risk assessment data between countries is also important to create efficiency and save money. And what we propose in the report is to have certain global transparency criteria that would define what needs to be disclosed in products in order to have that data available to then drive those informed consumer choices and enable safe circularity of plastics. And then kind of coming a little bit back, what is the current level of transparency? Indeed, it is very limited. The Stockholm Convention has some mandatory labeling for POPs when they have specific exemptions for uses in plastics such as HBCD. Rotterdam Convention requires information on the trade of particular chemicals, some of which have uses in plastics, in order to provide, enable the PIP procedure. And then the Basel Convention requires transboundary movement of plastic waste must be accompanied by a movement specifying hazardous characteristics of waste, or that it is management, or that its management requires consideration. But the general requirement to provide information on chemicals throughout the life cycle is only a voluntary requirement under SAICM. And then this slide aims to tell what could be the role of a scientific mechanism. And it could be to develop and maintain sustainability criteria, including track updates and compatibility with the relevant MEAs, to assess new chemicals of concern and provide recommendations for listing, review and aggregate science on environment and human health, and then determine financial needs for developing countries to meet obligations to transition to safer chemicals and polymers. Then coming to the international sustainability criteria, which is one of the main recommendations of our report. So the aim of the criteria would be to fill the governance gaps, especially in the chemical and material phases. So the principles to guide the development of the criteria would focus especially on the performance outcomes when we design plastics. So what we want to achieve in the design of plastics would be non-toxicity through the criteria of listing, longevity of products in the market through reuse and repair, stability or integrity, so that microplastics products need to be recyclable, and also reduction and minimization is very important, so that we have less plastics on the market. And as said, this should be supported by transparency criteria across the life cycle of plastics. This could actually start with a phase. So outline the criteria in the text of the agreement through the INC process, and then perhaps later on provide a detailed criteria in possible annexes of the agreement through the COP decisions. So this slide aims to show how the international sustainability criteria, how they could provide opportunities for synergies. So on one hand, we would have certain principles to eliminate or minimize certain chemicals and harmful products. So the principle of non-toxicity would include criteria for elimination of chemicals of concern in plastics. And this would be additional to the existing criteria that we have under the Stockholm Convention, the Montreal Minamata Convention. The second principle would outline criteria for elimination of problematic plastics, such as single-use plastics. And here it would then support the Basel Convention that aims for waste minimization. And thirdly, the principle for stability could include criteria for minimization of releases of microplastics and chemicals of concern. And there are certain articles in the Stockholm Convention that already refer to this. And for the performance of the articles that are to stay in the market, we could have and under that we could have criteria for reusability, repairability, and minimized obsolescence. And then lastly, the principle for recyclability could include criteria for recyclability of plastics. And this would then support existing provisions under the Basel Convention on environmental management of waste and the guidelines on plastic wastes, and also the Stockholm Convention guidelines on environmentally sound management of POPs. And last slide. So how could the international sustainability criteria fill in the governance gaps? All right. So this is almost the last slide. I'm trying to draw in, on one hand, we have categories for control measures that would aim for elimination or minimization of the items to be removed from the economy. And here in the chemicals and polymers phase, we already have certain criteria and we have certain chemicals listed, but the new criteria would then complement these and try to eliminate other chemicals of concern in plastics. In the material and the products phase, we would then have criteria for minimization of releases of chemicals of concern and microplastics, and criteria for elimination of problematic plastics. And when it comes to performance, or specific control measures for increasing performance for items that are to stay in the economy, shown with green. And here again, this is the area where we have fundamental gaps in the current global governance of plastics chemicals, and introducing criteria for reusability and repairability within these gaps, and introducing criteria for the recyclability of plastics would then also fill in the gaps. And lastly, we have that transparency, where we could have the criteria for the transparency of plastics filling the gaps. And this has been a lot of information, maybe overwhelming for many of you, but these 5 key recommendations aim to summarize what we want to get through today is, firstly, develop criteria for sustainable design of plastics, focusing on performance and transparency. Then, under these, you could develop prioritization criteria to create global, negative, positive, or hybrid list using a grouping of approach to minimize and eliminate chemicals of concern and polymers of concern, develop trade controls, and establish a central knowledge hub to manage, store, and help access data to hazard, occurrence, and identities of chemicals and polymers of concern. And then lastly, to establish, mandate an existing scientific mechanism, develop, update prioritization and design criteria, and provide recommendations for listing chemicals and polymers of concern.
Thank you very much. Two excellent presentations. And then for our final speaker, Mr. Sverre Thomas Jar, perhaps, Government of Norway, Senior Advisor to the Department for Marine Management and Pollution Control. And Thomas will be reflecting on plastics and chemicals under the Stockholm Convention and potential synergies in relation to a future plastics treaty. The title of the presentation is Regulating Chemicals in Plastics under the Stockholm Convention and the Plastic Treaty. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. Thank you for this opportunity to speak on the importance of a strengthened global approach to chemicals of concern in plastics and polymers of concern. There have already been numerous or several side events on this topic, and it's a testament, I think, to the increasing attention this subject rightly receives. Plastic and plastic products, and also plastic waste, are part of our daily life and will continue to be. The attention given to negative consequences has so far been mainly on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Today, the focus will be on the challenges related to chemicals of concern, those used in plastic products, as well as the plastic material itself. Chemicals of concern in plastics, including polymers of concern, should be addressed both because they pose a threat to human health and the environment, and because they represent an obstacle to a circular economy. At another side event here on Tuesday, the Norwegian ambassador to the UN in Geneva referenced the scientific evidence on adverse health impacts related to plastics throughout the life cycle, especially for women, infants, and young children. This also impacts workers and residents of frontline communities, and we've seen examples of that here today, exposed to toxic chemicals used in or generated as a byproduct for the manufacturing of plastics. And they impact those people exposed to toxic chemicals further down the life cycle of plastics through use of plastic products and in the management of plastic waste, including waste pickers and waste recyclers. The need for non-toxic material cycles for plastic materials means that in the new circular economy, chemicals of concern must be taken out of the loop. New plastic materials should be sustainable and chemicals of concern substituted with safe alternatives. Today, some chemicals of concern, such as, for example, POP BDEs, Dicloram Plus, and UV328 that have been widely used in plastic products are under consideration for listing as POPs or have already been included in the Stockholm Convention. Measures to reduce or eliminate use of these POPs in plastics will remain in force irrespective of the provisions in the new plastic treaty. Existing exemptions in the Convention relevant to plastics should be further reviewed and phased out under the procedures set out by the Stockholm Convention. For non-POP substances, there are other examples of regulations such as the European bans on the use of phthalates and bisphenols in plastic materials. This includes plastics in toys, childcare articles, food contact materials, and electronic equipment. These substances have endocrine disrupting properties and therefore adverse effects on the human health and the environment. New restrictions are considered at the EU level. However, at the global level, no instrument is yet available for regulatory action on non-POP substances in plastic. For example, endocrine disruptors. The same applies to the use of metals like lead used as a stabilizer in PVC, and global action is thus needed. The Stockholm Convention gives an important basis to continue to ban POPs present in plastics. In addition to that, we seek a mechanism to address non-POPs chemicals of concern under the new Plastics Treaty, and I would like to further detail this. As co-chairs for the High Ambition Coalition to End Plastic Pollution, Rwanda and Norway made, as part of the preparation for the Options for Elements paper now published under the webpage for the INC, a submission which represents broadly the views of its now 53 members. It was 51 when I started writing this. The Plastics Treaty should include obligations for effectively phasing out or severely restricting the production and or use of specific polymers and chemicals that are harmful to the environment and human health, or are problematic because they impede circularity. We asked for the options paper to reflect options to eliminate and restrict specific polymers and chemicals of concern. We envisage a general obligation for each party to be required to eliminate and restrict the production and use of polymers and chemicals listed in an annex. The treaty should set criteria for identifying these chemicals of concern and list also the criteria in an annex, in our view. One set of possible criteria for identifying such chemicals would include, based on inherent properties, 1, substances that have slow or no degradation in the environment, 2, bioaccumulate, and or 3, have long-term toxic effects, for example, carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic, and endocrine disruptors. Another set of criteria for identifying chemicals that hinder recyclability or reuse could include composition and polymer mix, for example, mixed polymers and mixed material packaging. These criteria would not be cumulative. To render the treaty effective, we need transparency measures allowing access to data on chemicals in plastics throughout the value chain, as has been highlighted by others today here as well. Let me then add a few further remarks on behalf of Norway. Like the Stockholm Convention, the Plastics Treaty should include robust procedures for adding new chemicals and groups of chemicals to its global regulation. It should also include a ban on certain chemicals of concern upon its entry into force, the dirty first. We have enough knowledge to act also at the global level on a number of substances and groups of substances, and we should do that. Examples are substances and groups of substances like phthalates, bisphenols, PFASs, and metals. So, what happens if chemicals included in the Plastics Treaty are found to be POPs and nominated under the Stockholm Convention? One option would be to remove substances from the Plastics Treaty and regulate them under the Stockholm Convention. Given that these two treaties might have different sets of parties, different procedures, this may be difficult. So a substance might be regulated in both. For Norway, this would not be a problem. We would have an obligation to ban it under the Stockholm Convention and under the new treaty. We also envisage that there would be exemptions for certain uses. For example, flame retardants would still be necessary in plastics for some users. Finally, for some chemicals, we have knowledge about their properties, but limited knowledge about their use in plastics. We must seek that necessary knowledge. This goes inter alia for substances used as additives in different plastic products. It includes softeners, stabilizers, and so on. We also need more knowledge about the plastic material itself, the polymers that are building blocks of plastics. We need to identify which polymers that are of concern and limit their use. We see the Intergovernmental Science Policy Panel on Chemicals, Waste and Pollution as an important tool in this respect. We would also like to explore further the possibility of a science policy interface supplementary to the SPP and dedicated to procedures under the new treaty, POPROC for chemicals in plastics and polymers. The exact interface between the new treaty and the Basel Convention remains to be identified. We note, however, that both the Stockholm and the Minamata Conventions refer to the Basel Convention for important aspects of the management of related waste. We hope the INC meeting in Paris later this month will mandate intersessional work on specific issues, such as the procedures and criteria I have described here today. I look forward to the discussion and thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, and I hope that my vision is shared more widely and there's more members joining the coalition in that respect very soon. So thank you very much again. And I'd just like one more round of applause for all of our speakers here tonight on the side of it. And we do have a question and answer session. I just make, we have had one online comment come through and I'll just start with that. And that was a comment from Elham in Egypt, who notes that major industrial countries must be obligated to send all information about the chemicals in the products they send to their country. So very important in terms of right to know and freedom of information in terms of imports of chemicals. So thank you for that comment. And any questions from the audience for our panelists? I can see a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Thank you, presenters, for the good presentation. My question, what we are talking about yet is about the chemical product. And now the concern, the hazardous chemical contained in those products. The issue is only identification. How the user, the end user, would identify that scenario or those type of hazardous chemical. And what might be the law of producers who are producing those chemicals, especially on genetic information to make it available for users. Thank you.
To take that. Sure.
So having the data available across the value chain of products is, of course, a very new aspect, especially for recycling that you are referring to. Have that in the recycling phase, if I understood correctly, data available. I believe that the car industry is a good example because they already have every part of the car. There is this information available when it goes for recycling, that they can access content of those car parts. And this is something that maybe could be used also when we try to think about transparency in the new plastics instrument. So we need to have that information in the package, but also in the specific products themselves. And how this could be done in practical terms, is of course a big question mark, with some sort of a QR code or watermark or something where we access the data of that specific product or component would be very important. think about.
Thank you. Yes. Would you like to have a?
Yes, please. I think it's also something that we're seeing more and more, that there are access to databases, there are labeling requirements or other means of identification types of requirements. And I think this is also a step towards having producers internalize more of the costs associated with plastics. The more that we're seeing numbers on what the externalized costs of plastic harm is, the more we can see that that harm is even higher than the internalized revenue. So right now, the industry has a lot to gain from the production of plastics, but the costs are typically borne by communities. So having more of this internalized in the industry with different types of identifications and traceability would be an important step.
Thank you.
Could I just?
Yes, sure.
I mean, it's always dangerous for someone at head of Dell level to start engaging on technical issues. But I mean, if we look at a PET bottle, for example, that is recycled. And you would know it's a PET bottle, you would know what it contains. And I think from our perspective, that's something we are looking at also when we look at regulating chemicals in plastics. You would have products, I mean, you would have, this kind of plastic, you would know almost instinctively what kind of chemicals are in that and how you could recycle it. Yeah. So this kind of, PET bottle is one potential sort of template for how to move forward, and also something we are thinking of when we are looking at how to, the necessity to regulate chemicals and plastics. Yeah.
Another question there in the middle. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all for your great work. My question is more, I mean, you focused a lot about recyclability and reusability, but there's another category of plastics like the biodegradables that are used in dispersive applications, such as in agriculture, or if you also think about these detergents that you have in for washing machines and dishwashers that are made of water-soluble polymers. How do you deal with those and in terms of regulation or making sure that they're safe?
Thoughts?
Start. Well, of course, the agreement needs to have specific definitions so that we know what are bioplastics, what means degradable, what means biodegradable or compostable. So making clear definitions would be a good starting point, for example. And then to have also certain criteria for sustainable sourcing of plastics. So if we go and use more biomass to produce plastics, we need to ensure that it's sourced so that it doesn't affect, for example, biodiversity or food security and so on. So I think that's an important aspect if we aim to transition to the use of biomass-based plastics.
And I'll jump in
Sure.
here as well. I thank you so much for raising the issue of biodegradable plastics. This is something that's being discussed more and more. It's also something where we see that the science is getting clearer and clearer, that bio-based plastic, biodegradable plastics are no safer in terms of toxicity, in terms of chemicals, than fossil fuel-based plastics. And we're still talking about additives that are being added in a very uncontrollable and non-transparent manner. All the tests that are done show repeatedly that these types of plastics have the same concerns as conventional plastics if we're talking about harm on human and environmental health, except they're sourced from different sources.
I just think that I'd like to echo that. I mean, biodegradable, what is that? And again, to Nico's point on the need for definitions. Sure. It sounds very good with biodegradable, but I mean, no.
Certainly.
I guess I think it's also about identifying it so that if you don't want it in your waste stream, in your recycled material, you need to be able to sort it out. do something else with it.
Yes, yes, I think that's a common theme with a lot of the plastics we're talking about is identification, so you can manage waste streams. And there was a part of the component of the question was about, I think like polyvinyl alcohols, the sort of plastics that are used in dishwashing machines that coat the tablets that you wash them with, and how to manage those because they dissolve in water. I don't think anyone's come up with a solution to that yet, but I think the key is to identify them and to make them shine some light on them through things like the technical guidelines that we have here. And once they're identified, then we can make progress towards looking at how to better manage them and potentially filter them or manage them in other environmentally sound ways. So I think the key is, and we've seen it in all the presentations, is there's not a lot of information on a lot of these materials. And the more information we have and the more we make available, the better decisions we can make about how to manage them. So while we don't have a solution to that particular one at the moment, I think it's important that people are aware of it because it's something that's obviously a common polymer that's used in most households. And did I see Roland Weber? Yes, thank you.
Yeah. I think, Teresa, I think that was a bit too simplified that we said they are same toxic and all are toxic. So when you look to the studies of Wagner, also on the biodegradable plastic, so some of them he did not find real toxicity. And it's the same when you look to the JRC study of alternative plastics to the bisphenol A plastic. Yeah, you also found some where they hardly find any toxicity. So I think there are some top runners, and I think this could be a good starting point.
I love the level of detail that we're getting into here because it.
Yeah, but to just say everything is.
So the Zimmermann et al. Article, which Wagner was also part of, was a very thorough publication where they looked at a lot of different types of plastics that were some were biodegradable, some were it was different types.
I mean,
and I don't remember the exact wording of how they concluded, but I remember that they were talking about how there's the same kinds of concern. I would agree that doesn't mean that that's like means that all bioplastics have the same, but no. And actually, sorry, in a way, I would still agree with that because there's the transparency issue.
Yeah, that's another.
Exactly. So because we can't say it at this point because we don't know what's in there. We don't know what kind of additives is in there. They end up efficiently, practically having very similar levels of concern, very similar types of concern.
Yeah, so you have some where you find toxicity and high toxicity similar than to others, and then you have a few polymers where they did not find toxicity, and I think then you should look to these and then promote those and shoot out the others.
Thank you for that exchange. And was there any other comments?
Yes, one more comments.
Oh, yes, certainly, over here. Thank you.
So as rightly pointed out by the speakers, the scientific community should be very careful regarding the three terms: bioplastics, biodegradable, and combustible. And industries, especially in developing countries, they picked up these three words and they are playing very well. So it gives the impression that all these terms mean that they are non-toxic. It may not contain any additives. So the scientific community should be very, very careful in dealing with these three terms. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any further reactions? Some additional questions? Yes.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for all your presentation. So I think it was like highlighted one of the gaps, it is the customs codes. So this is really very important, and mainly it is not following what is coming in the different conventions when they do the restrictions. Because when we go, for example, to the customs codes, we find like polymers, and under this you have a lot that can come to the country. And this is specifically for our developing countries, which is different from, because we don't have the capacities of the control. So I think this is also key, how we can engage the customs the global organization, the international organization of customs, so to follow, because whenever even we ban a chemical, so it can enter under another name. So with that we don't know, and this is also, it is a big game. So we'd like also to perhaps to think about and to work in parallel.
Very good point. And mislabeling and faulty labeling of different materials and products coming through customs is a growing issue, I think, with wastes and with products. So good point. I did think I saw one other hand. Yes? That's you, yes.
It's a bit of a follow-up to my previous discussion regarding, let's say, the water-soluble polymers. But currently, or as far as I've seen, the definition of plastics that's been discussed in the INC is the one based on the MARPOL Convention, which includes that it is a solid particle that is insoluble, which means that the water-soluble polymers will go under the radar in this discussion. Is that going to be addressed in the plastics definition, or is that envisioned? It's a negotiation process, maybe a question to the Norwegian government.
Yeah, thanks for putting me on the spot. And of course, I'd love to refer to one of my experts. It's a very good point. And can I just say, as my minister often does, I'll take that with me and come back to you.
Any other reactions from the panel?
No, I guess we've also sort of thought about the definition of plastic pollution, because that's what the resolution refers to, and we don't have a definition of plastics yet. We don't have a definition of plastic pollution. So what we looked at really was the scope of plastic pollution and how we can try and address it from a scope perspective. Yes.
Yes, and I think there's further negotiations to go on that. So perhaps that will be addressed through the INC process, definitional issues and scope as it progresses this year. So, thank you for that. Any further questions? Over near the wall there, yes, sir.
Just the last one. In the presentation, you highlighted some data on the unregulated product. What might be the cause of that? Is it a forced declaration, or there is no yet means in place to do the regulation of those products? I think it is from Madam there, where it came from.
Well, we didn't look into what the causes were for it. I imagine that it could be a lot of different causes, but I would say that the underlying problem is that there's so little transparency in how chemicals are used in plastics overall, which means that it's not regulated what you need to provide for kind of information. So if that means that all these other reasons for why it might have happened, be that contamination or be that intentional, is possible, since there's nothing preventing it.
Just on it, I guess what we're trying to do is reverse engineer the product to understand it instead of having that information up front.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we're about drawing to the end of our time here today. So I think I'll wrap up here, but thank you very much, everyone in the audience and on the panel, for a very interesting discussion.
For the contact group, yeah, sector.